"Open wide for me," Mountain Man whispered to his terrified, obese wife, his real purpose. "Open wide for me," Tobias said in a low, serious voice. The words struck Clementine Harper like thunder. She froze, her heart hammering in her chest, eyes wide with confusion and fear. She had been a wife for less than 24 hours, sold in truth to a man she barely knew, and now he was giving her that order. Clementine Clem Harper, 22, stood trembling in the dusty sunlight of the barn, her round cheeks flushed red, her breath quick and shallow. She had been sent here married off to settle her father's debts after her mother's long illness drained the family dry. Now she belonged to Tobias Blackstone, a man whispered about in town, a mountain doctor, half healer, half recluse, with eyes as sharp as a hawk's and hands that could save or break. When Tobias repeated himself, quieter this time, "Clem, open your mouth, now," tears sprang to her eyes. She thought she understood what kind of man he really was. But then something strange happened. Tobias frowned, not in anger, but in confusion, and reached into his worn leather bag, pulling out a small light and a pair of gloves. "You've been coughing since we left town," he said calmly. "I need to check your throat. Infection spreads fast up here. Open wide so I can help you." Clem blinked, speechless. All the fear in her chest drained away, replaced by something entirely new, shock and a flicker of trust. The man she had feared wasn't demanding. He was caring. Still, as she sat there, her heart racing, one question echoed inside her. Who was this man, and why did he choose to marry her when he could have had anyone else? Clementine Harper had always been the girl people whispered about, but never truly saw. In the small Appalachian town of Rose Hollow, she was the fat daughter, the one who never fit into church dresses, who turned crimson when boys laughed behind her back. Yet beneath the softness others mocked was a heart that refused to grow bitter, a woman who had spent her youth tending to her sick mother while her father gambled away the little they had left. When her mother died that spring, Clementine thought the worst had passed. But debt has a cruel way of outliving love. Her father, desperate and ashamed, struck a deal with the only man who would listen, Tobias Blackstone. Tobias was unlike any man in Rose Hollow. He lived 3 miles up the mountain, past the winding trails and mist-covered ridges where few dared go. He was a veteran, a farmer, and most unusually, a trained veterinarian who had once studied medicine in Charleston before tragedy drove him away. Some said he'd lost his wife. Others said he'd lost his faith. What was certain was this: Tobias healed creatures others would put down and charged nothing but honesty in return. When Clementine's father came begging, Tobias didn't ask for money. He asked for a promise. "I'll pay your debt," he said, his voice even, "but I won't do it for you. I'll do it for her. If she agrees to come with me freely, I'll see she's never hungry or afraid again." Her father agreed before Clementine could speak. By the time she understood what was happening, her name was signed on a marriage license and a carriage was waiting outside. Their wedding was quiet, no music, no flowers, only the sound of rain striking the church roof. Tobias stood tall and calm as the preacher spoke, his eyes unreadable. When the ceremony ended, he simply said, "Pack what you need. We leave at dawn." Now, standing in the dim light of Tobias's barn a day later, Clementine realized how little she knew about the man who was now her husband. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't kind, either, not yet. He was measured. Every movement had purpose. Every word felt weighted. He spoke more to his animals than to people, and when he looked at her, she couldn't tell if he saw a wife, a burden, or a patient to tend to. That night, he served her soup by the fireplace and said quietly, "You don't owe me fear, Clementine. Eat, rest, and heal. That's all I ask." It wasn't what she expected. No harsh demands, no unwanted touch, just that calm, low voice, steady as the crackling fire. Later, when she lay awake in the guest bed, she could hear him moving in the next room, writing in his journal, tending to the fire, humming a tune she didn't recognize. Outside, rain swept across the mountains. Inside, she whispered to herself the same question that had haunted her since the wedding. Why me? And somewhere down the hall, as if he could hear her through the walls, Tobias murmured under his breath, "Because I needed someone who still believes in care more than in judgment." The next morning, dawn came wrapped in fog. The mountains were silent except for the soft whicker of horses and the creak of leather harnesses. Tobias was already outside when Clementine awoke, chopping firewood in a white shirt rolled up to his forearms, breath steaming in the cold air. He didn't look at her when he spoke. "Breakfast is on the stove. We've got work to do after you eat." Clem sat at the small wooden table, still unsure if she was allowed to ask questions. The porridge was thick, sweetened with honey, and she was halfway through before she realized he must have made it himself. The simple thought that he had cooked for her unsettled her more than she expected. When they set off for the upper pastures later that morning, she followed Tobias on horseback through the fog, her heart racing with every hoofbeat. The mountain path wound through dense pines and trickling brooks, the air so cold it bit at her cheeks. She tried to speak once or twice, but the words never found courage enough to leave her mouth. Halfway up the trail, her horse stumbled on loose rocks. She gasped, clutching the reins too tight, but before she could fall, Tobias's voice cut through the silence deep, commanding, protective. "Easy. Don't pull. Let him find his balance." His horse moved beside hers, close enough that she could see the faint scar along his jaw, the one she'd been too afraid to ask about. He reached over, steadying her hand on the reins. "Good. There. See? The mountain teaches you to trust your footing and to breathe." It wasn't just advice about riding, and somehow she knew it. By midday, they reached a clearing where the air smelled of pine resin and sunlight. Tobias dismounted, gesturing for her to do the same. "We'll rest here." He unpacked a kettle, poured her tea from a tin cup, and said quietly, "Drink. You're pale." "I'm fine," she insisted, though her voice betrayed her exhaustion. "You're not," he said flatly, sitting across from her on a fallen log. "You haven't eaten enough for the work ahead. You need strength here, not apologies." Clementine looked up, startled. "Apologies?" He met her eyes for the first time all morning. "You keep saying sorry. To the floor, to the wind, to yourself. Stop doing that." The words hit her harder than she expected. No one had ever told her she didn't need to apologize for existing. The rest of the day unfolded quietly. They repaired a broken fence, checked on a sick cow, and gathered herbs Tobias used for medicine. Whenever he spoke, it was to teach, not command. He showed her which plants soothed fevers, which stopped bleeding, which cured coughs. She listened carefully, her hands trembling at first, but steadier as the hours passed. When a storm rolled in that evening, Tobias led her back down the trail. The wind howled through the trees, and rain began to fall in cold sheets. By the time they reached the cabin, both were soaked to the skin. Inside, Tobias lit the fire and turned to her, his voice firm but gentle. "Get those clothes off and change into something dry. You'll catch your death otherwise." She froze, startled, remembering the night before the way she had misunderstood him. Tobias sighed softly and turned his back. "I'll be in the kitchen," he said over his shoulder. "There's soup on the stove. Eat when you're ready." An hour later, dry and warm again, Clementine stepped into the kitchen. He was sitting at the table, sketching in a worn notebook a drawing of a horse's jaw, labeled neatly in ink. He looked up when she entered. "Feeling better?" "Yes," she said, smiling shyly. "Thank you." He nodded once, his mouth curving into something that almost resembled a smile. "Good. Tomorrow I'll teach you to stitch a wound. It's easier than it sounds." That night, as the storm raged outside, Clementine lay awake in her room, listening to the steady rhythm of his boots on the floorboards. It wasn't fear that kept her awake anymore. It was something warmer, something that made her chest ache. For the first time, she thought, maybe this marriage wasn't a prison. Maybe it was the start of a healing neither of them had planned for. The days that followed settled into a rhythm quiet, practical, and strangely comforting. Mornings began before sunrise with the lowing of cattle and the smell of wood smoke curling from the chimney. Tobias rose first, always, his movements deliberate and efficient, as if he'd lived this life for 100 years. By the time Clementine came downstairs, sleepy and flustered, there was already coffee on the stove and a fire burning in the hearth. At first, she felt useless. She wasn't strong enough to lift hay bales or mend fences, and her clumsy attempts at chopping wood made Tobias wince in silence. But instead of mocking her, he simply took the axe from her hands and said, "Let me show you." He didn't laugh. He didn't sigh. He stood behind her, his calloused hands guiding hers on the handle, his voice low and calm. "It's not about force, it's about rhythm. Breathe in, lift, swing through. Let the wood split itself." When the log cracked cleanly in two, she turned to look at him, flushed and proud. Tobias gave a short nod, a wordless compliment, then picked up the next piece for her to try again. That became the quiet pattern of their life together. Tobias taught, and Clementine learned. Some lessons were practical: how to milk a cow, how to suture a small wound, how to read the sky for storms. Others were subtler: how to stand her ground, how to stop apologizing for being herself. She cooked for him in return, rediscovering her joy in the kitchen. Tobias was a man who worked hard and ate little, always claiming he wasn't hungry. But she noticed the way he slowed down when she set a fresh loaf of cornbread on the table, the way his gaze softened when she served stew with herbs she'd gathered herself. One evening, after a long day tending to a sick calf, he sat at the table while she kneaded dough. The light from the oil lamp flickered across his face, catching the faint scar along his cheek. "You should rest," he said. "I like keeping busy," she replied without looking up. "Busy and exhausted aren't the same thing." She smiled faintly. "You say that like someone who's learned the difference." He paused, setting down his cup. "Maybe I have." That was how she learned about the shadows in his past, little by little, like pages of a book revealed one at a time. He had once worked in a city practice, tending to both people and animals. But an epidemic took his younger sister, and the guilt had driven him from the world. "I saved strangers," he said quietly, staring into the fire. "But not her. So I came here where the only thing I can hurt is myself." Clementine wanted to reach for him, then to tell him he wasn't alone. That guilt doesn't heal by isolation, but she couldn't find the words. Instead, she stirred the soup, her hand trembling just slightly, and whispered, "You didn't fail her. You're still saving lives every day." He didn't answer, but when their eyes met across the table, something unspoken passed between them, not pity, but understanding. That night, as rain tapped gently on the cabin roof, Tobias left a cup of chamomile tea by her bedroom door. No note, no words. Just the quiet kindness of a man who had begun to care. Over the next few weeks, their silences changed shape. They were no longer heavy or awkward, they were comfortable. When they worked in the fields, their movements began to align without needing to speak. When they sat by the fire, reading from the same medical book, their shoulders brushed without flinching. One night, she burned her hand while tending the stove. Tobias caught it immediately, his large hand surprisingly gentle as he ran cool water over the burn. "You need to be more careful," he murmured. "I'm sorry," she said out of habit. He looked at her, eyes steady. "Stop apologizing for being human, Clementine." She met his gaze, something inside her breaking open, not in pain, but in release. And for the first time since she'd come to the mountain, she felt safe. By mid-autumn, the cabin had become more than a roof over Clementine's head. It was a heartbeat, a rhythm that pulsed with quiet work and shared breath. She no longer startled at Tobias's voice or flinched at his silence, but the mountain, like all things that heal, had a way of testing what it gave. It began with a letter. Tobias found it tucked under the grain sacks one morning, a thick envelope stamped with the seal of the Charleston Medical Board. He didn't open it at first, only stared at the handwriting, the past rising in his throat like smoke. Clementine sensed something shift in him that day, a stillness too sharp to be peace. That night, after dinner, she found him sitting alone on the porch, the letter in his hand. Moonlight brushed the scar on his face, turning it pale. "You can read it," she said softly. He didn't look up. "It's from the hospital where I used to work. They're reopening the research program, asking me to return." Her chest tightened. "Will you?" Tobias exhaled slowly, the paper trembling in his fingers. "I don't know. I left that world for a reason, but—" His voice trailed off. "The mountains are small. Sometimes I wonder if staying here is healing or hiding." Clementine didn't know what to say. She wanted to tell him he'd built something real here, that his care for people and animals was worth more than any city title. But she also knew the ache of being underestimated, of wanting to prove yourself to a world that never looked twice. The following days grew heavy with silence. Tobias worked longer hours, mending fences, checking on livestock, avoiding her eyes. Clementine, afraid of being left behind, began to doubt the fragile peace they'd built. Then, one afternoon, trouble came riding up the hill. It was Sheriff Dunn, a man with a permanent sneer and a ledger for a heart. He dismounted roughly, dust rising around his boots. "Afternoon, Blackstone," he said, tipping his hat with mock courtesy. "Heard the city's looking for you. Word is you've been playing doctor up here without a license." Tobias's jaw tightened. "I treat whoever needs help. You've known that for years." The sheriff smirked. "Yeah, well, now there's a bounty for it. City wants you back or wants you gone. Either way, they're paying." His eyes slid toward Clementine. "And what about the missus? She's still not legal kin, is she? Paperwork's thin as mountain air." Clementine's stomach turned cold. "Leave her out of this," Tobias said, stepping forward. "Can't do that," Dunn drawled. "A man breaks the law. His woman pays the price, too. That's how it works around here." Before Tobias could respond, Clementine spoke. Her voice shook, but the words were clear. "You're wrong, Sheriff. That's not how it works anymore." Both men froze. She stepped forward, shoulders squared. "My husband saves lives. Yours is spent ruining them. If the city wants proof of his worth, they can come see the families he's healed, the children he's brought back from fever, the animals he's kept alive through the winter. And if you want to drag us down that mountain—" She met Dunn's gaze without flinching. "You'll have to go through me." The sheriff's smirk faltered. He muttered something about stubborn mountain folk and turned back to his horse. When he was gone, Tobias stared at her not in disbelief, but in something deeper, respect. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly. "Yes," she replied, breath trembling. "I did." He stepped closer, his voice low. "Clem, I don't think I can go back to that life, not after this." "Then don't," she whispered. "Stay. Stay where you're needed. Stay with me." The wind swept through the trees, carrying away the last of the tension. Tobias reached out and brushed his thumb across her cheek, not in possession, but in gratitude. "Then I will." For the first time, the mountain didn't feel like a place to hide. It felt like home. Winter crept down the mountain in silence. The first snow fell heavy and fast, blanketing the cabin in white, muting every sound except the crackle of firewood and the heartbeat of the wind. Clementine had begun to believe the storm outside would be the only one they'd face that season until the sound of hoofbeats shattered the quiet. 3 men rode up through the snow, coats dark, badges glinting under gray sky. City officials. Behind them, a wagon bearing the seal of the Charleston Medical Board. Tobias stepped outside before they even dismounted, coat unbuttoned, unarmed, but his posture steady the stance of a man done running. Clementine followed, her breath turning to frost. "Dr. Tobias Blackstone," the man in front announced, voice crisp and rehearsed. "You are hereby ordered to cease all medical activity and return to Charleston for disciplinary review." "I don't answer to your city anymore," Tobias said, voice low but unwavering. "You do when lives are at risk," the man replied coldly. "Operating without a license is a criminal act. You've played doctor long enough." Clementine's pulse roared in her ears. "Played?" she echoed, stepping forward. "He's saved this entire valley. Ask the children who walk again because of him. Ask the mothers who didn't bury their babies this winter." The man's expression barely flickered. "Miss Harper, we're not here to debate sentiment." "Mrs. Blackstone," Tobias corrected, his tone sharp as a blade. "And if you think I'll abandon my people in the middle of winter to satisfy your pride, you're mistaken." The leader gestured, and one of the officers stepped forward with a pair of handcuffs. Clementine moved instinctively, placing herself between Tobias and the man. "You'll have to cuff us both," she said, her voice shaking but clear. The official hesitated, clearly unprepared for resistance. Then, from beyond the tree line, came another sound, dozens of hoofbeats, growing louder. Within moments, men and women from the nearby farms appeared, forming a half-circle around the officials. These were the people Tobias had healed, fed, and guided through the harsh mountain winters. An old farmer shouted, "He ain't leaving, and you ain't taking him." A chorus followed, voices strong, defiant, echoing off the snow. The officials exchanged uneasy glances. The leader finally exhaled, turning back to Tobias. "You'll regret this. The law will come for you." Tobias met his gaze without blinking. "Then let it climb the mountain. It's a long way up." The men mounted their horses and rode off, their shapes swallowed by the storm. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then the old farmer grinned through his beard. "Guess the doctor's staying, eh?" A ripple of laughter rolled through the crowd before they slowly dispersed, leaving Tobias and Clementine standing in the falling snow. He turned to her, his voice breaking the stillness. "You shouldn't have done that." "I'd do it again," she said softly. "Every time." Tobias smiled, the kind of smile that carried both relief and surrender. "Then I suppose I owe you my life." Clementine reached for his hand, squeezing it tight. "No, you gave me mine first." And as the snow swirled around them, two figures stood at the edge of the world, not fugitives, not victims, but partners who had defied the cold, the law, and the past itself. The storm passed overnight, leaving the world washed in white silence. Morning light spilled through the cabin windows, touching the floorboards, the books, the teacup still half full from the night before. Clementine woke first. Tobias was already at the stove, sleeves rolled up, cooking breakfast like it was any ordinary day, except it wasn't. Something had shifted in the air, in both of them. The fear that had haunted the cabin for months was gone. She walked up behind him quietly. "You didn't sleep." He stirred the pot, smiled faintly. "Didn't need to. I kept listening for the law to come back, but all I heard was the wind." "Maybe the wind's on our side," she whispered. He turned, ladle in hand, eyes soft. "Maybe it is." They ate together at the table, the fire crackling between them. Outside, the snow shimmered under the sun like 1,000 shards of glass. For the first time since their marriage, Tobias didn't look like a man burdened by ghosts, and Clementine didn't look like a woman waiting for permission to exist. When breakfast was done, he stood by the window and said quietly, "You know, I never thought peace could look like this." Clementine rose, crossed to him, and slipped her hand into his. "It's not peace," she said, her voice soft but sure. "It's rebuilding." He looked at her, truly looked and nodded. "Then let's keep building." That evening, as the mountain turned gold under the setting sun, Tobias was outside mending the barn door, while Clementine wrote in a small notebook, "Our first winter as free people." The camera of memory lingered on the cabin, glowing against the snow, smoke curling upward, two lights, two souls, standing strong where the world once tried to break them. "You're safe here," he told her that night, wrapping her hand in his. "It's your home now, if you'll have it." And she smiled, tears glinting in firelight. "I already do." Sometimes love doesn't arrive with flowers or perfect words. Sometimes it comes disguised as a storm fierce, frightening, and full of truth. Clementine and Tobias taught us that healing isn't about escaping the past. It's about finding someone who stays when the world tells them to leave. It's about learning that open wide doesn't mean surrender, it means trust. Wherever you are in the world tonight, maybe you're still waiting for your own kind of healing. If you still believe in love that saves rather than hurts, this story was meant for you. Now tell me, where are you listening from tonight?